In 1994, Kimberly Nilsson was a 24-year-old student on the cusp of a bright future. Little did anyone know, the bizarre and disturbing sequence of events that was about to kick off in August of that year would change everything in an instant. Originally from Alameda, California, she was a top student at Arizona State University at Tempe and was preparing to begin her final semester as a pre-med major. Despite her outward success, Kimberly was privately struggling with emotional turmoil in the months leading up to her disappearance. She had recently gone through a painful breakup with her boyfriend, reportedly the first time she had ever been on the receiving end of a breakup, and it hit her hard. Diary entries later reviewed by investigators revealed that Kimberly was suffering from depression and feelings of alienation after the split. In an effort to heal her emotional wounds, Kimberly began reading a book on Native American herbs given to her by her ex-boyfriend's grandmother. This exploration sparked a specific interest in a certain psychoactive cactus used traditionally in spiritual rituals. As the fall semester approached, Kimberly's behavior took a bizarre turn. On Sunday, August 21st, 1994, the day before classes were to start, she spent time with several friends, but her actions were described as erratic and out of character. That morning, Kimberly invited two male friends, Jeff Saliga and Steve Chambers, to join her on a bike ride. During the ride, she confided to Jeff that the presence of Steve made her uncomfortable, though she wouldn't explain why. She then abruptly changed the subject by mentioning a neighbor she suspected of being a peeping Tom at her apartment complex. Later that day, Kimberly stopped by the apartment of another friend, Tor Staub. Tor would later report that Kimberly seemed preoccupied by something she wouldn't talk about. She even snapped at him in an uncharacteristically rude way when he offered her herbal tea. As that Sunday went on, Kimberly's condition seemed to worsen. By approximately 3:30 p.m. on August 21st, her roommate found Kimberly at home, hunched over and vomiting in the bathroom. When the roommate knocked to check on her, Kimberly shouted for her to go away and leave her alone. It turns out that the magic psychoactive cactus that had attracted her attention in the wake of the breakup was peyote. This sudden bout of vomiting and agitation has led many to suspect that Kimberly may have followed through with her curiosity about peyote that day. Notably, riding the cactus comet is known to cause intense nausea as a side effect, and the timing suggests she could have consumed it earlier, leading to illness by the afternoon. Feeling unwell, Kimberly called in sick to her job that evening and lay down to rest. After a nap, around 5:30 p.m., she woke up and had a phone conversation with a friend, Bob Leet. On the call, she downplayed her condition, attributing it to a simple stomach bug, and even chatted about plans to attend an upcoming Lollapalooza music festival. Notably, it was an event she and her ex-boyfriend both had tickets for. At this point, Kimberly still seemed to be looking toward the future, mentioning she'd see everyone at the concert despite her current illness. As night fell on August 21st, Kimberly's actions grew increasingly strange and disoriented. She made a series of perplexing phone calls that evening. In one instance, she dialed a friend in Flagstaff, but spoke to them as if they were her ex-boyfriend. It took her several confused minutes to realize she had called the wrong person, suggesting she wasn't thinking clearly. Around 7 p.m., Kimberly called Bob Leet a second time, this time in an agitated state. She rambled about a bizarre dream and told Bob that she felt she couldn't trust him or Tor anymore. Confusingly, she then expressed anxiety about having been rude to Tor earlier in the day. Her roommate also observed Kimberly's behavior that night and noted that she was acting irrationally and that her pupils were extremely dilated. This is a physiological sign often consistent with entering the cactus matrix. By approximately 9:30 p.m. on the 21st, Kimberly's restless energy hadn't subsided. She phoned another friend, whose birthday was that day, and said she wanted to come by his house to wish him a happy birthday in person. Despite having been to this friend's home many times before, Kimberly inexplicably got lost en route. She left her apartment, then returned shortly afterward, telling her roommate she needed to call the friend again for directions. This was a curious request given her familiarity with the location. After getting directions, Kimberly drove off once more, only to circle back a second time, still apparently confused. She left her apartment yet again, this time for good, sometime in the late evening or night of August 21st. These multiple false starts and her confusion about directions strongly indicated that Kimberly was in a disturbed state of mind. Notably, this evening would be the last time her roommate or anyone else ever saw her alive. The morning of August 22, 1994, was supposed to mark the beginning of Kimberly's final semester at ASU, but instead it became the day she was officially reported missing. A close friend arrived at Kimberly's apartment around 9:30 to pick her up for their first class of the term, only to find that Kimberly wasn't there. Alarmed, the friend and Kimberly's roommate realized something was very wrong. Meanwhile, that same morning in a quiet upscale neighborhood of North Scottsdale, roughly 20 miles from Tempe, an unusual discovery was made. At about 9 a.m. on August 22nd, the homeowners at a house near the intersection of Pima Road and Thompson Peak Parkway returned from running morning errands. Curiously, they found a black Volkswagen Rabbit parked in their driveway, partially blocking the entrance to their garage. It was Kimberly's car, and the homeowners stated that the car had definitely not been there at 7:40 a.m. when they left the house. The vehicle was found abandoned under odd circumstances. The doors were unlocked, the keys were still in the ignition, and inside were all of Kimberly's personal belongings. There were no immediate signs of a struggle, but one eerie clue was noted on the floor of the car. A page was torn from Kimberly's diary that had a hand-drawn map to her friend Tor's house on it. It was as if she, or someone, had been looking for Tor's place again, though Tor lived in Tempe, not near where the car was found. Ultimately, while this appeared to be a significant clue early on, nothing came out of it. Police canine units were brought in, and the dogs traced Kimberly's scent from the car up to the front door of the nearby house. It was almost as if she had walked up and tried to ring the doorbell. However, investigators later questioned this result, suspecting that the scent trail might have been inadvertently carried by an officer who had touched Kimberly's car. Once Kimberly Nilsson went missing under suspicious circumstances, a full-scale official investigation was launched, drawing in multiple law enforcement agencies. Investigators meticulously searched Kimberly's apartment and belongings for clues. Inside her room, they found a small quantity of street cabbage, but no peyote. They did find the herbal medicine book that had so captivated her, with some relevant pages bookmarked, suggesting she was indeed serious about her research into the topic. From late August 1994 into the fall, police followed up on hundreds of tips that poured in from the public. In fact, Tempe police logged over 300 tips from people around Arizona and beyond who thought they might have seen Kimberly or saw her distinctive black rabbit in various locations. Every one of her friends was questioned, including her ex-boyfriend. Notably, her ex-boyfriend had been in California at the time of her disappearance, and he was cleared as a suspect. A breakthrough, or at least the next chapter in the case, came in the spring of 1995. On April 12th, roughly 8 months after Kimberly vanished, a startling discovery was made. A ranch hand was out on horseback in a remote desert area of Scottsdale, about 2 miles from where Kimberly's car had been found. He was checking a barbed wire fence on a cattle range in the late evening when he stumbled upon something disturbing: a human skull. The authorities were called, and they ended up recovering about 90% of a human skeleton, and with the dental records, they were able to confirm this was Kimberly Nilsson. Forensic examination of the bones yielded frustratingly little information. The medical examiner couldn't determine an exact cause of death. There were no obvious signs of trauma on the parts of the skeleton that were recovered. Examiners found no bullet holes and no fractures to indicate severe blows. However, given the state of the remains, this didn't rule out foul play. Soft tissue injuries, like certain kinds of internal trauma, wouldn't necessarily show up on bones. Unfortunately, the very bone that often breaks in cases of strangling, the hyoid, was missing. The medical examiner collected bone marrow from one of Kimberly's leg bones, and even some hair and what little desiccated tissue was left. This was done in hopes toxicology tests or other analyses might detect poison, substances, or other clues. But by then, after months under the brutal Arizona sun, the biological materials were too degraded to yield any results. In the end, the death was officially deemed suspicious and remained unresolved. In the absence of definitive evidence, a number of theories have emerged over the years to explain what might have happened to Kimberly. Investigators and those who followed the case have proposed two primary scenarios from the start: foul play versus fatal misadventure. One theory is that Kimberly's experimentation with substances led her into the desert in an altered mental state, where she ultimately succumbed to the harsh environment. The evidence supporting this includes her well-documented strange behavior on August 21st. The vomiting, dilated pupils, confusion about phone numbers and locations, and her paranoid statements all point towards someone possibly under the influence. Cactus tripping in particular can cause intense hallucinations and disorientation for many hours. If Kimberly did take a large dose, intentionally or accidentally, she may have become delirious. In that state, she could have driven out toward the mountains, parked in a random driveway, and wandered off into the desert in the early morning hours. Tragically, the Arizona desert in August can be deadly. Daytime temperatures soar, and an impaired person without water could quickly fall victim to dehydration, heat stroke, or become injured on the rocky terrain. Alternatively, it's been suggested that the breakup with her boyfriend may have caused a mental break, leading to roughly the same effects, and also explaining her bizarre behavior. The other leading theory is that Kimberly Nilsson met with foul play. Proponents of this theory argue that Kimberly's unusual state made her vulnerable to predators. It's conceivable that an opportunistic criminal might have seen a disoriented woman alone and abducted or hurt her. The placement of the car could have been a ruse by an offender to delay investigation or distance themselves from the scene of the crime. While this theory makes sense, it's ultimately entirely circumstantial. This, of course, isn't to say that she didn't meet with foul play, and there's no doubt that she was in an extremely vulnerable state at the time she went missing, opening her up to an attack. Officially, Kimberly Nilsson's case remains unsolved and is classified as an open cold case. Whether she fell victim to a bad trip or something much worse continues to remain a chilling, unresolved mystery. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just quickly plugging my podcast, Lazy Chill True Crime. It's got a ton of my content from this channel and my True Crime channel, as well as some bonus content you won't see or hear anywhere else. In the early 20th century, Chicago's underworld had an undisputed king in Big Jim Colosimo. Born Vincenzo Colosimo in 1878 in Italy, he came to Chicago as a teenager and rose from shoe shiner and petty thief to the city's foremost vice lord. By the 1900s, Big Jim, also known as Diamond Jim for his love of flashy jewelry, controlled a thriving criminal empire. He married a prominent madam in 1902 and befriended local corrupt politicians. Backed by these corrupt city officials, Big Jim consolidated the city's vice operations into a lucrative racket. In doing so, he effectively laid the foundation for what would later be known as the Chicago Outfit. Big Jimmy's power and popularity were notable, and he very clearly wasn't your typical shady underworld figure who attempted to keep a low profile. Big Jim was, to put it simply, a man of big appetites. He was a jovial, outgoing figure who reveled in his success, earning him the Big Jim moniker as much for his personality as for his stature. By the 1910s, he owned the opulent Colosimo's Cafe on South Wabash Avenue, a nightclub where Chicago's high society rubbed shoulders with underworld figures. Celebrities and politicians alike dined at Colosimo's establishment, underscoring the influence he wielded in both crime and city politics. That said, with Chicago politics at the time, there wasn't too much difference between the two regardless. To guard his growing empire, Big Jim brought in his relative by marriage, Johnny Torrio, from New York in 1909. By 1920, Colosimo had spent nearly 2 decades at the top of Chicago's vice world, seemingly untouchable as the city's crime boss. However, the fact that Big Jim isn't a household name, while Al Capone is one of the most famous gangsters in history, should tell you that Jim wouldn't be around for much longer. The enactment of Prohibition in January 1920 presented a new illicit opportunity: bootlegging booze. Torrio urged Big Jim to capitalize on this lucrative trade, but Colosimo balked. He was content with his thriving underground businesses and feared that large-scale bootlegging would draw unwanted federal attention. Big Jimmy may have had every corrupt Chicago politician in his pocket, but the same couldn't be said for the feds. At the same time, Colosimo's personal life was in flux. He divorced Victoria Moresco, who was also Torrio's aunt, in early 1920, and quickly married a young singer, Dale Winter, in April of that year. This combination of a personal split and a business disagreement with Torrio may have proven to be fateful. Colosimo's reluctance to embrace the new bootleg liquor racket left his ambitious lieutenant increasingly frustrated, and his sudden divorce and marriage upset old alliances. The stage was set for a violent change at the top, and as they say, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. On May 11th, 1920, just weeks after his wedding, Big Jim arrived at his lavish restaurant expecting a business meeting that he would never leave alive. That afternoon, Colosimo had phoned his new bride to say he'd be late for dinner because he had an important meeting with an unknown man at his restaurant. The cafe was closed between meal services with only a few staff on site when Big Jimmy swaggered in looking for his appointment. He asked a waiter if anyone had been by, and hearing no, Big Jim went to his office to wait. The ambiance was eerily quiet. No patrons, just the clink of dishes in the kitchen and the shuffle of employees preparing for meal service that evening. After a short while with no sign of his expected guest, Colosimo grew uneasy and stepped out of his office into the lobby. At that very moment, an assailant was lying in wait. As Colosimo peered through a door toward the street, perhaps looking for a visitor, a figure crept up from behind. A sudden shot cracked through the empty restaurant. Big Jim was struck in the back of the head, hitting the base of his skull. He collapsed instantly, sprawled on the marble floor of his own upscale cafe. The perpetrator had timed the attack perfectly. Colosimo was alone and unguarded in that brief moment. In the aftermath, the shooter slipped out into the afternoon light, vanishing before anyone could stop him. The slaying of such a prominent mob boss sparked immediate theories, and Chicago's rumor mill went into overdrive. The press originally attempted to tie it all to his controversial divorce and remarriage, suggesting his ex-wife wanted Jimmy cut down to size. While this may have sold papers, there was simply no evidence for it, and other more plausible theories began to emerge. Besides the jilted ex-wife angle, another early theory pointed to the Black Hand, a shadowy network of Southern Italian extortionists. In establishing the Chicago outfit, Big Jim and his boys had ended up piling up members of this loosely organized group into Chicago gutters. Some speculated that those old vendettas had finally caught up to him in 1920, and the authorities knew he was a marked man in these circles. However, these Black Hand groups were already in massive decline by 1920, and no evidence tied these groups to the attack. These accusations helped deflect attention from what would soon emerge as the most likely scenario, an inside job from within Colosimo's own outfit. Scrutinizing who stood to gain from Big Jim's demise led investigators and informed observers to focus on Johnny Torrio, Colosimo's trusted underboss. Torrio had been loyally running Colosimo's operations and protecting him for years, yet he also had the ambition and foresight that Big Jim increasingly lacked. With prohibition in effect, Torrio was eager to dive into bootlegging and rack up fortunes as a booze baron, but Colosimo's stubborn refusal was an obstacle. Eliminating Colosimo cleared the way for Torrio to take over and transform the organization, and almost immediately after the slaying, Torrio's behavior raised eyebrows. He took charge of the situation with remarkable poise and organized an extravagant funeral for Big Jim, all while beginning to exercise power in his own right. To many observers, it looked as though the old lion had been felled by an up-and-comer, and the pride was now firmly under the control of Johnny and a new generation of mobsters. Or, in this analogy, new generation of lions. But hey, it sounded kind of silly when I read it aloud. The most widely accepted theory is that Johnny Torrio ordered the hit on Big Jim. According to this theory, Torrio privately arranged for a trusted hitman from New York to do the job, keeping his own hands as clean as possible in the circumstances. Torrio had connections to the New York underworld from his earlier days, notably his friendship with Frankie Yale, a notorious Brooklyn mobster. In the spring of 1920, Torrio supposedly reached out to Yale for help eliminating Big Jim, knowing that an out-of-town professional would arouse less suspicion among Chicago police. By some accounts, Torrio even convened a meeting with New York gang leaders to get their blessing for him to become Chicago's new boss, once Colosimo was gone. Another name inevitably surfaced in the rumor mill: Al Capone. Capone was a young protege of Torrio, who had recently arrived from New York to help with Colosimo's enterprises. Later legends accused Capone of very direct involvement in the whacking of Big Jim, with some even claiming that Al Capone himself was the trigger man. However, most historians find this unlikely, as Capone was still an up-and-comer at the time and may not have been trusted with such a big job. Further, it remains an open question if Capone was even in Chicago on the day in question. It's more plausible that Capone's role was to help Torrio consolidate power after Big Jim was gone, rather than to execute the hit himself. Ultimately, whether or not Capone had any direct hand in the attack, he unquestionably benefited from it. The slaying of Big Jim removed the old guard and opened the door for Torrio and Capone's generation to take over Chicago. And the rest, as they say, is history. While the whodunit was never proven in court, the Torrio-Yale theory remains the most compelling and widely accepted. That said, Big Jim spent his life running up untrustworthy friends and bitter foes in equal measure, so the question can never be answered with complete certainty. In June 2016, Floyd Roberts III, a 52-year-old high school teacher and former NASA engineer from Florida, would go missing under mysterious circumstances. An avid outdoorsman, he joined two friends for a backcountry hike in a remote part of the Grand Canyon. Roberts had decades of hiking experience and was well prepared with food, water, and maps for the planned 9-day journey. The group's route would take them across the rugged Shivwitz Plateau, and down to the Colorado River, eventually exiting the canyon on June 26th. For Roberts and his friends, this trek was meant to be a grand adventure, and they had done a similar trip in 2010. But on the very first day of the 2016 trip, Roberts mysteriously disappeared, sparking an intense search and a baffling mystery that remains unsolved. On day one of the hike, June 17th, 2016, the trio encountered a hill near an area called Kelly Tank. They decided to take two different routes around it and meet up shortly after. His companions climbed over the hill while Floyd walked around its base. When his friends reached the other side, Roberts was nowhere to be seen. They waited and called his name, then retraced their steps back to where they last saw him, but found no sign of their friend. By the next morning, they realized something was very wrong. They hiked until they could get a cell phone signal and called for help. Roberts was officially reported missing to park authorities on June 18th, nearly 24 hours after he had last been seen. The National Park Service launched a large search and rescue operation immediately. The location in the western Grand Canyon was extremely remote and rugged, making access difficult. Park rangers, volunteer wilderness searchers, and search and rescue teams from 2 counties converged to help. A base camp was established near Roberts's last known location to coordinate the effort. Over the next 6 days, dozens of people scoured roughly 10 square miles of canyon and plateau country on foot and by helicopter. They faced harsh conditions. An extreme heat wave had temperatures well over 100 degrees, and the terrain was dense with brush, cliffs, and steep ravines. Despite these challenges, searchers combed the area day and night, determined to find any sign of Roberts. Helicopters flew low over ravines looking for the bright red of his shirt or the blue of his backpack, and search dogs were brought in to track his scent. Some potential clues did surface, and at one point, a set of shoe prints was spotted in the dirt, but rangers could not confirm if it belonged to Roberts. No other trace of him or his equipment turned up during the extensive sweep. By June 23rd, after an exhaustive effort, officials had to scale back the search. With no leads left to pursue, the operation shifted to a limited search, where rangers would keep an eye out during routine patrols. In the absence of evidence, several theories have been proposed about what might have happened to Floyd Roberts. The main ideas include an accidental fall, disorientation leading to exposure, possible foul play, and even a voluntary disappearance. One possibility is that Roberts suffered a misstep and fell into a hidden canyon or off a ledge. The area is full of sheer drops and tricky terrain. If he fell and was injured or killed, his body could be concealed in a spot that search teams never checked, which would explain why nothing was found. There have been numerous cases in the Grand Canyon where a missing hiker's remains were discovered only years later in a hard-to-reach area. Another theory is that he became lost and succumbed to the elements. Facing extreme heat and lack of water, Roberts, despite being an experienced hiker, may have become extremely disoriented and confused. Roberts might have wandered in the wrong direction seeking a route or water source and eventually collapsed from dehydration or heat stroke. If he moved beyond the search zone before he died, his remains could still lie undiscovered in the vast maze of side canyons. Alternatively, he may have sought refuge somewhere hidden and perished there. Investigators considered foul play, but found no evidence to support it. The authorities considered it unlikely he encountered a hostile stranger in such an isolated area. Further, his hiking companions, who were reported to be a father and daughter who were his longtime friends, alerted authorities as soon as possible. They also cooperated fully with the investigation and were almost immediately ruled out as suspects. Park officials found no signs of a struggle or any other indication of criminal activity at the scene. The absence of any evidence makes foul play a remote possibility, and most observers lean away from this theory. Another theory suggests that a wild animal such as a cougar could have attacked him and taken him away from the area. However, mountain lion attacks are extremely rare, and there was no sign of any encounter between one of these big cats and Floyd. Some have speculated that Roberts chose to deliberately vanish. This would mean using the trip as an opportunity to leave his life behind and start anew. However, those who knew him saw no indications of this. He had a stable job and family ties and was excited about the hike. Further, no motive or any proof of planning ever surfaced. Thus, this theory is generally considered the least likely by the authorities. Nearly 9 years have passed since Floyd Roberts went missing, and the National Park Service still lists his case as an open investigation. Ego death, a concept often associated with mysticism, psychology, and psychedelic experiences, refers to the temporary or permanent loss of one's sense of self or personal identity. It's been discussed in the context of yoga, Buddhism, and the esoteric practices of Western occultism. Ego death has deep historical roots across multiple belief systems. In Eastern traditions such as Buddhism, the concept of no self is central, emphasizing that the sense of an enduring I is an illusion. Early Christian mystics, like Meister Eckhart, described a similar process of detachment from personal identity in order to unite with the divine. Psychedelic culture, especially during the 1960s, popularized the term ego death in the West. Influential figures like Timothy Leary wrote extensively on how substances such as LSD might dissolve the boundaries of self, catapulting users into states of cosmic union or profound insight. One of the primary principles underlying ego death is the dissolution of the boundaries of personal identity. In everyday life, we typically operate within a sense of me and mine. During ego death, this self-referential mindset drops away or is radically altered. The individual may experience a sense of vastness, oneness, or unity with all that is. This can be liberating, as it reveals the extent to which the ego is a mental construct, but it can also be terrifying, as it threatens one's accustomed sense of control. Another core aspect of ego death is the loss of personal narratives. Our identities are partially shaped by stories we tell about ourselves, our past experiences, future ambitions, and subjective opinions. When these narratives no longer hold sway, a person might feel they're losing everything they know about who they are. However, proponents argue this temporary loss of identity can result in a deeper understanding of reality, unfiltered by conditioned beliefs. From a psychological perspective, ego death may resemble experiences of ego dissolution, which have been studied in clinical settings. Researchers investigating the therapeutic potential of psychedelics report that individuals who undergo these events often describe it as one of the most meaningful experiences of their lives. Within esoteric and occult traditions, ego death is sometimes viewed as an initiation into higher mysteries. Practices associated with ceremonial magic and certain forms of mysticism often encourage the adept to move beyond the personal self in order to access higher planes of consciousness. By transcending the ego, the practitioner may communicate with angelic or elemental forces, connect with archetypal symbols, and gain knowledge from non-ordinary sources. While ego death can be transformative, it's important to approach it with caution. A sudden, unprepared dissolution of identity may lead to psychological distress, confusion, or disassociation. Individuals who pursue ego death experiences, either through psychedelics or intense spiritual practices, are generally advised to have a strong support system and a clear intention. It's also vital to note that ego death isn't about permanently eradicating one's sense of self, at least not generally. Rather, it's most often described as recognizing the constructed nature of the ego. By seeing through it, individuals may learn to use the ego skillfully without being entirely governed by it.